Robb Stark stood in the courtyard of Winterfell as the cold wind scoured the ramparts. The sky, an endless drape of pale gray, bore a gentle swirl of snow that settled on Robb's broad shoulders. His auburn hair fluttered in that wind, a restless banner above a face grown older and more somber since the day he had ridden south at his father's side. Yet now he was king in the north, declared so by his bannermen in the tumult after Lord Eddard Stark's execution. The title weighed upon him, a brand as hot as any forging in a blacksmith's flames. That day, however, the northern chill bit with unusual sharpness, and there was a different tension in the air, something beyond war councils and marching armies. The courtyard was emptier than usual. Only a handful of Winterfell's guards attended to their duties, pacing back and forth or hunched over by the stable doors for warmth. A few stray direwolves prowled the edges of sight. Grey Wind, Robb's own companion, stood watchfully near the great hall's doors, his keen eyes set on his master. The direwolf's presence brought Robb small comfort even in the swirl of anxiety that had owned him these last moons. He had returned from battle momentarily, needing to regroup, to talk with his mother, and to gather fresh men. Winterfell felt smaller now, though. He had felt that loss the moment he'd ridden through the gates. So many had gone south with him to fight. So many would not return. But duty demanded he come home. The war was far from settled, and beyond the trappings of steel and sigils, a deeper mystery was calling to him. He had felt it in his bones. The news had come via ravens from deep in the north. Rumors of ancient relics discovered near the burrows of old kings and the long-forgotten tombs in the stony ground beyond the great bar Rolands. Most ravens carried ill tidings of war, King Joffrey's cruelty, Lord Tywin's armies on the move, or the Ironborn reaving along the northern shores. But one message had rung differently. It whispered of something hidden in the dark, something that might change the shape of the war. Even Catelyn Stark, reeling from her husband's death, had recognized the gravity. She had pressed the letter into Robb's hand, her eyes shining with a desperate kind of hope. If there was the slightest chance it was true, it might shift the balance. It might save them. And that was why Robb had braved the icy roads to come here. That was why he had not marched south to face Tywin again. Not yet. He retreated into the great keep, letting Grey Wind follow him at his flank. Inside, the rushes on the floor were new, muffling the echo of his boots. A small retinue of guards and retainers joined him, lighting torches against the dim corridor. Winterfell's thick walls were always somewhat forbidding, but on that day, they felt like the hold of a giant creature, ancient and brooding. He nodded to the guards to remain behind as he proceeded to a lesser-known stairway, one that took him beneath the great keep and toward the labyrinth of corridors beneath. He wore no crown, no fur cloak that would mark him as king, only his well-worn leather jerkin and breeches. Even so, he felt his status with every breath. The North looked to him for guidance, for victory, for vengeance. Eddard Stark had been the steel that bound the realm's honor, and now that steel had been torn away. Robb could feel every eye upon him, waiting to see if he would prove worthy. Down in the depths of Winterfell, the walls grew tighter, the cold more insistent, and the stones older. He passed storerooms, some of them half collapsed, some sealed by heavy wooden doors. He heard, at one point, the scrape of claws, a rat or two rummaging in the dark. The gloom pressed close, but he continued with determined steps until he came to a locked door made of stout oak, reinforced by black iron. There, a single guard nodded at him. Robb returned the nod and produced a key from his belt. It was an old key scoured with tarnish. Maester Luwin had given it to him with trembling hands. Inside, the room was small and Spartan. A single brazier sat in the center, glowing faintly. Catelyn Stark stood near a stone table with her hands clasped, her face lit by the flicker of flame and worry. She turned at the sound of her son's footsteps. For a moment, she did not speak. The years of grief seemed carved into her face, but there was still that motherly softness in her eyes, the same that had soothed Robb as a child. "You came," she said softly. "I had to," Robb replied, setting a hand on her shoulder. Grey Wind loomed at his side, sniffing the air. "Is it here?" She nodded. Her eyes flicked toward the table, where a lump rested under a heavy cloth of black wool. Robb could see a faint shape beneath, round and faintly scaled, as large as a melon. A hush fell upon them both, as if they could not fully name what they might behold. The brazier hissed with an ember. Caitlin let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for days, and gently, she pulled the cloth aside. Underneath lay something that looked not of this world. Dark scales shimmered with a subtle swirl of color, as though capturing the brazier's light in a mosaic of moody reds and deep greens. The surface had the texture of stone, but it also glinted with a hidden vitality. Robb inhaled sharply, heart pounding. He had never seen a dragon egg in his life, but the old stories told enough. A relic from the times when Targaryens commanded the skies on the backs of winged beasts, a time well before the North had become tangled with the South's intrigues. Now, if the rumors and the battered knowledge carried by the old maesters were true, a dragon egg was worthless and dead, a curio from centuries ago. But something inside Robb said otherwise. Some deep place in his gut told him that if the stories of old Valyria had any truth, if the slightest ember of magic remained in the land, an egg could stir again. "You believe it's real," Robb said, trying to keep the tremor from his voice. Caitlin lowered her gaze. "Yes, Luwin's not certain. He thinks it more likely to be a clever forgery or a petrified piece of nonsense. But I saw him at his reading. I saw the shift in his eyes as he studied the scales. There's a chance, small, but there." Robb gently ran his fingertips over the shell. It felt cold and ancient, the ridges of the scales distinct. Somehow it felt heavier than its size suggested. A latent power, or perhaps simply the weight of legend. Where did it come from? She told him of the message that had arrived from a small lodge near the Bar Rolands. A northern traveler claimed to have found the egg in a hidden cache beneath a fallen September. The old stones had caved in, revealing an opening deeper still. He and his companions found a small chest, sealed with Targaryen sigils, though battered by centuries of neglect. Inside, they discovered only this. Some among them wanted to sell it to Lannisters or perhaps to the Iron Bank in Braavos. But the traveler, who had known the Starks in childhood, decided to reach out to Winterfell first. He had lost kin in the war. It seemed a small vengeance, maybe, to give the Starks a chance at something powerful before the Lannisters. From there, the rumor reached Caitlin. She had purchased it, quietly, with gold from her personal reserves, and had it smuggled to Winterfell under a heavy cloak. Only a select few even knew of its presence. Robb listened, stunned. He thought of all the times his father had told him that the age of magic was gone. And yet now, in these dark hours, a sign from older days had fallen into their laps. He swallowed hard. "This doesn't change the war, at least not yet," he said. "It could be naught but a rock." Caitlyn's voice thinned. "We have to try. You're the king in the north now, Robb. If this is real, you must find a way to awaken it." Robb looked at her. "How?" "The Targaryens used fire and blood, or so the stories say. Daenerys Targaryen, if the rumors are true, she walked into a pyre to hatch her eggs. That's not something we can simply replicate here. Winterfell is no black salt sea of Valyria. We do not have the blood of the dragon in our veins. Perhaps we have the blood of the first men," Caitlin said softly, though her Tully heritage contrasted with her words. "And perhaps the heart of the North is stronger than we know. If magic is stirring in these lands again, if the nights are growing longer, who knows what might be possible? Who knows what strange powers gather in the cold?" She let the cloth fall again, covering the egg as though it were some sleeping child in need of rest. Robb saw a flash of desperation in her eyes. She was not wrong to hope. In a war that threatened to crush them on all sides, Lannisters to the south, Greyjoys circling the coasts, Freys wavering in their loyalties, this lonely relic could tip the scales. Even if it was only a symbol, it could rally men to his cause. But the thought of a living dragon, that notion danced through Robb's mind and caused his pulse to hammer. If the North had a dragon, what man would not tremble to face them? The Lannisters might cower behind their gold, but gold would melt like any other metal in the breath of a dragon's fire. He reached across the table and clasped his mother's hand. "We'll keep this secret," he said. "Tell no one beyond those you trust with your life. If word spreads and the Lannisters discover we have it, they'll do anything to wrest it from our grasp." Catelyn squeezed his hand in return. "I've told Maester Luwin, of course. And I told Theon, before he left for the Iron Islands, that there was a precious cargo coming here, though I never told him what. I wanted him to understand that we had hidden resources before he departed. But beyond that, no one knows its nature." Robb felt a flicker of unease at the mention of Theon Greyjoy. He had trusted Theon as a brother, but war changed men, and the Greyjoys were proud. He hoped that trust was not misplaced. He forced the doubt away and turned his attention again to the egg. "We'll need to research old texts, anything that might mention the secrets of dragon hatchings. If there's any chance it can be coaxed to life." His words faded, for he could scarcely believe them. Yet as the dim brazier light glistened across those scaled ridges, he thought he saw something in the egg's surface. A faint flicker, a ripple in the color. He exhaled slowly, unsettled and strangely enthralled. That night, Robb did not sleep well. Memories warred with half-formed dreams of dragons circling Winterfell's towers. He dreamt of a roaring beast of shadow and flame, perched on the walls of the ancient keep, lightning cracking behind it, and the banners of the direwolf snapping in the wind. It breathed fire that lit up the snows of the courtyard. In the dream, Robb stood before it with gray wind, and the dragon lowered its colossal head. He reached out a trembling hand and touched its snout, feeling the furnace heat of its breath on his face. Then the dragon's eyes flicked open, blue as ice, not the red or gold he had expected. The dream changed, turning to a vision of swirling snow and white walkers, and the scythe of fear tore him from sleep. He sat upright in his bedchamber, sweat dripping down his brow despite the chill. Gray wind lay curled at the foot of the bed, eyes half open, as if aware of his master's disturbance. Outside, the night was quiet, the moon a ghostly orb in the winter sky. Robb pressed a hand to his chest. He expected his heart to be racing, but it was slow and deliberate, each beat echoing in his ears. He told himself it was just a dream, yet a small voice whispered that there was truth in dreams. The old gods of the north sometimes spoke in glimpses. Morning came without fanfare. The sun was a dull glow behind the clouds, and a thin dusting of fresh snow had fallen overnight. Robb rose early, dragging a comb through his hair, donning a warm tunic with the Stark sigil embroidered in dark thread. He descended once more into the bowels of Winterfell, ignoring the protest in his legs from the previous day's travel. Outside that locked chamber, he found Maester Luwin waiting. The older man cradled a few ancient tomes in his arms, the spines worn to near illegibility. "My lord," Luwin said softly, shifting the books, "I took the liberty of searching the library tower for any records that might shed light on dragon lore." Robb gave him a tight smile. "Thank you, Maester." He took a long breath, steeling himself. "How is it? The egg, any changes?" Luwin hesitated. "None that I can see. I've examined it. The surface is warm to the touch at times, though that may just be my imagination. Perhaps the brazier's heat is playing tricks on my mind. But I would not presume to say it's entirely inert." That small spark of hope flared in Robb's chest. "Then we must study. Let on." The two of them entered. Catelyn was there, as was a single guard whose name Robb recalled was Kedge. He was a loyal man from one of the minor houses sworn to the Starks. He stood silent, watchful, and showed no curiosity beyond what his duty required. Robb was grateful for that. The fewer who asked questions, the better. Maester Luwin spread the books on a stone bench and opened them, revealing old Valyrian glyphs, high Valyrian inscriptions, and some translations scrawled in the margins. One tome was a ragged compilation of Targaryen lineage, beginning with Aegon the Conqueror. Another was a collection of legends about the birth of dragons, how they thrived in the volcanoes of Valyria, and how Targaryen might once have had magical rights to hatch them. Robb looked at these texts with a furrowed brow. There was nothing straightforward, no simple instructions. Instead, he saw half-truths, contradictory statements, references to rituals of blood sacrifice, and the repeated mention of fire and blood. "This talk of blood sacrifice," Caitlin murmured. "We can't go that way. We can't kill innocents on the hope of awakening an egg." Robb's gaze hardened. "We won't. That's not our way. And if that is the price, I'll forfeit the dragon rather than become some butcher." Luwin cleared his throat. "There may be alternative methods. One of these accounts suggests that heat and life might stir the egg. Some speak of the presence of one with Targaryen blood, though that might not be feasible. Others imply that the presence of old magic from the children of the forest or the old gods might aid in a hatching. It's all speculation. Magic is uncertain." Robb ran a hand over his jaw, a habit he had picked up from his father. The old gods. Could there be a way to harness the heart of the weirwood trees? Or the crypts under Winterfell, where the hot springs run close to the surface? Luwin looked thoughtful. "The hot springs keep Winterfell warm. Yes, the crypts are ancient. There's a resonance there, I suppose. We know so little, my lord. Even the children of the forest used to dwell among such places. We cannot dismiss it out of hand." Caitlyn's gaze flicked to the egg. "We must be careful. If there's truly power in the crypts, it might be dangerous." Robb nodded, swallowing. A plan began to form. If the crypts of Winterfell truly harbored a trace of the old magic, perhaps the swirling heat of the springs could serve as a kind of natural incubator. It was a wild idea, but he had to try. He had seen war turn men to cinders. He would not let the same happen to his house without seizing every advantage. Later that day, after ensuring that his presence was not demanded by any immediate crisis, Robb took Grey Wind and a small party of trusted guards down to the crypts. The guards remained at the entrance, while Robb ventured in with only Grey Wind to accompany him. Caitlin remained behind, unsettled by the thought of disturbing that silent place of Stark ancestors. Torchlight chased away the darkness as Robb descended. The air, strangely warmer than the winter wind above, had a deep, still quality that resonated in his chest. The statues of old Stark kings and lords lined the crypt, each with a stone direwolf at their feet, each with a sword laid across their lap, though many swords had rusted away or been stolen by previous generations. Robb walked slowly, passing the tomb of his grandfather Ricard, then that of his Aunt Lyanna. In the gloom, he felt the hush of centuries. Grey Wind padded silently beside him, muzzle low, occasionally turning to sniff the air as if uneasy. When Robb reached the lowest level, he paused. He could hear the faint trickle of water from somewhere behind the walls. Steam wafted gently from cracks in the stone, carrying with it the subtle scent of minerals. "This is an old place," he said quietly, though no one was there to hear except the spirits of his forebears. "If there's magic in the north, it might dwell here." Robb had brought the egg, cradled in a stout chest lined with thick furs. He set it down gently, then lifted the lid. The egg gleamed in the torchlight, dark and lovely, like a promise of power. Carefully, Robb knelt beside a small pool where the hot water bubbled up through the stone, collecting before it seeped away deeper into the earth. He placed the egg near that warmth, resting it on the rock. The steam curled around it in ghostly fingers, and for an instant, Robb could have sworn he saw the shell ripple again, like the reflection of firelight on armor. He closed his eyes. The Targaryens might have prayed to their own gods or invoked Valyrian spells, but Robb was of the north. So he offered a quiet prayer to the old gods, the nameless watchers who dwelt in Weirwoods. He recalled the dream of the dragon with eyes of ice. He hoped that was not a sign that this egg belonged to a darker force. Yet he set aside his fears. If the old gods were listening, he begged them to guide him, to protect his land, to let this be a righteous endeavor and not a step into ruin. Grey Wind let out a low rumble, his hackles lifting. Robb opened his eyes, worried something had approached, but saw only empty darkness between the torchlit arches. The direwolf stared down the tunnel, as though sensing something Robb could not. After a time, Grey Wind settled again, though his ears remained pricked. Robb lingered in the crypt for what felt like hours, watching the egg, listening for any sign. At one point, his torch sputtered low, and he had to replace it. The egg never moved, but the warmth of the vents rose around it, and Robb told himself he might be doing the right thing. Eventually, he realized he couldn't stay indefinitely. War was ongoing. He had responsibilities to see to. With a sigh, he left the egg in that sheltered alcove, trusting that none but he and his mother and Maester Luwin would venture down here. He quietly resolved to return as often as he could, to watch for changes, to keep the egg's existence hidden until a sign revealed itself. The next weeks passed in a flurry of duties. Ravens came daily bearing ill news. The Ironborn had seized parts of the North's coastline, burning and pillaging. Roose Bolton reported that the Freys were uneasy allies at best. Tywin Lannister was regrouping, gathering a host to reclaim the Riverlands. Meanwhile, Robb's men grew weary. Supplies ran thin. He spent countless hours in the Great Hall, hearing petitions, planning strategies, forging alliances. Through it all, the thought of that egg weighed on him. Whenever he had a spare moment, often in the dead of night, he would steal away to the crypts to check on it. At first, there was no sign of change. The shell remained as it was, stone-like and mysterious. But one night, when Robb pressed his hand to the egg, he thought he felt a faint vibration, like a distant heartbeat. He jerked his hand away, unsure if it was real or merely the trembling of his own pulses. Heart hammering, he placed both palms on the egg, waiting, breath held. There it was again, a barely perceptible thrum, as though something within was stirring. Gray wind let out a soft whine, leaning forward to sniff the egg's surface. "Gods!" Robb whispered, his breath caught in his throat. In that moment, he was a child again, overcome by wonder. Then a wave of determination flooded him. If the egg was awakening, if it truly held life, what would it mean for the North? He could scarcely imagine the power that would give them, nor the danger it might bring. Yet the war was already full of peril. A dragon might be their best chance to ensure the Stark name remained unbroken. He stroked the egg's shell with tentative gentleness. "If you live," he murmured, "know that I will not use you lightly. I will keep my father's honor. The North is your cradle, your home. Maybe you'll fight for us, or maybe you'll destroy us." He wasn't sure why he spoke as if it could hear him, but words came unbidden. When he left that night, Robb could not sleep. He paced his chamber, mind roiling. The next day, he confided in Catelyn and Maester Luwin. They both looked stunned. "It can't be," Luwin said. "Dragons have been gone for over a century. Yet if anyone had told me a year ago that magic was returning to the world, I'd have dismissed it," Robb replied. "But I've seen shadowy shapes beyond the wall. My brother Jon wrote about them. I've heard the rumors of Daenerys Stormborn and her dragons far across the sea. So perhaps it can be true." Catelyn clasped her hands, a new light in her eyes. "Then we must do what we can to nurture it. Keep it warm, keep it near the weirwood magic. We must be discreet." And discreet they were. Only the most loyal Winterfell servants brought extra fuel to the crypt's braziers and ensured no one wandered into that forsaken corner. Robb visited more frequently, sometimes bringing offerings of raw meat to the egg, though he felt foolish doing so. He remembered old tales of dragon keepers feeding eggs with blood, but he rejected the idea of taking blood from a living person to feed it. Instead, he tried smaller, safer methods: warmth, whispered words, and quiet prayer. Over time, the pulse grew stronger. An energy seemed to emanate from the egg, filling that alcove with a subtle aura of heat, more than the hot springs alone could account for. Robb felt it whenever he drew near, an insistent thrumming, like a second heartbeat echoing in the stone. Gray wind grew uneasy in its presence, pacing around the egg but never growling outright. Some nights, the direwolf sat vigil with ears pricked, as though hearing voices beyond Robb's perception. Elsewhere, the war continued to press its demands. Theon Greyjoy's betrayal came like a knife in the dark. He took Winterfell by surprise, capturing Bran and Rickon. Robb was away at the time, commanding troops in the Riverlands, but the news nearly shattered him. Horror and fury warred in his chest as he realized Theon had turned cloak to seize the north in his father's name. In that desperate hour, Catelyn fled south with a retinue, hoping to find safety for Rickon and Bran, but they were separated in the chaos. Theon proclaimed himself Prince of Winterfell, and the castle fell under the Ironborn yoke. Servants were put to the sword, the direwolves were scattered, and for days, no one knew if the younger Starks still lived. The north reeled. Robb raged, but he had an army pinned in the Riverlands, cornered by the Lannisters. The timing of it all threatened to crush him in a pincer of despair. He could not abandon his men to march north, not if Tywin Lannister would exploit his absence. Amid that crisis, one urgent thought seared Robb's mind. The egg. He had left it in the crypts, in Theon's grasp. If the Ironborn discovered it, they could destroy it or sell it to the highest bidder. And if they learned it was stirring, they might do worse. The notion struck at Robb's heart. That dragon egg might be the only chance for the North to break its enemies and survive. Theon must not have it. Raven's sword, carrying messages between scattered northern loyalists. Through secret missives, Robb discovered that Theon had posted men in the crypts but had not yet uncovered the hidden alcove where the egg lay. It was too deep, too out of sight. Yet it was only a matter of time if Theon or his brutes went rummaging around. Desperate, Robb took a bold step. He dispatched a small band of trusted riders, men loyal to House Stark above all else, to retake Winterfell from within. They were to slip into the crypts under cover of night, retrieve the egg, and flee to a safe haven. The risk was huge, but time was running out. Those men rode under the command of Robb's close friend Daron Hornwood, whose house was devoutly loyal and had lost family to the Ironborn raids. Daron took with him a half-dozen men. They passed stealthily through lesser-known roads in the Wolfswood, waiting for the cloak of night before approaching Winterfell's outer walls. Theon's men were not as watchful underground as they were above, and with the help of some sympathetic servants, the band managed to slip inside. They navigated the winding corridors, hugging shadows. Each footstep threatened discovery. At one point, they had to hide from a pair of drunken Ironborn who came lurching by, laughing coarsely about reaving and the spoils of war. But the band pressed on. When they reached the locked door that led downward, they found it broken ajar, presumably battered by Theon's men searching for valuables. Daron's heart pounded. They entered cautiously, torches unlit. The darkness swallowed them. One step at a time, they descended into the crypt's depths, feeling along the damp walls. The smell of earth and centuries-old stone filled their noses. A faint glimmer of ghostly steam rose from somewhere deeper. Then they heard it, a rhythmic sound, at once like a heartbeat and a distant drum. Daron felt it in his bones and glanced around at his men in alarm. None knew what manner of sorcery was at work. The further they went, the stronger the sense of presence became. At last, they found the alcove. A single brazier flickered weakly, revealing the egg perched on a stone dais. In the torch's dull glow, the egg looked alive with swirling color, as though molten embers churned beneath its surface. Daron approached with reverence, scarcely believing the fables. He reached a trembling hand to lift it. The egg was warm, heavier than he expected, and it seemed to pulse in his grip. He stifled a gasp. He could almost imagine a creature within, stirring, yearning to break free. The men with him, loyal and stalwart, exchanged uneasy glances. One of them, with voice quivering, asked if they dared remove it from this cradle. "We must," Daron said. "The king in the north commanded it. This is our only hope." He wrapped the egg carefully in furs and placed it in a satchel they had brought for the purpose. Then, quietly as ghosts, they retraced their steps. Fear dogged each footfall. If they were discovered, Theon's men would give no quarter, and the egg would be lost. But the old gods seemed to favor them, for they reached the surface without alarm. A brief scuffle occurred near the outer wall, where they caught two Ironborn guards unawares. The men died with muffled cries, and the band hurried on, hearts hammering. Moments later, they vanished into the night with the egg. Riding hard through the Wolfswood, Daron's group evaded Theon's patrols. Dawn found them exhausted but alive, hidden in a safe glen known only to northern hunters. There, Darren sent a raven to Robb, notifying him of success. Robb was in the Riverlands near Riverrun at the time, struggling to hold back Tywin's forces. Yet upon reading that the egg was safe, a fierce relief flooded him. Meanwhile, Theon discovered the intrusion too late. He found the battered remains of the men on the wall, discovered the open crypts, and realized something precious had been taken, though he did not know exactly what. His fury was boundless. He took out his rage on the remaining servants, and Winterfell groaned under the Ironborn's cruelty. But the egg was gone, slipped through his fingers like so much smoke. In the weeks that followed, Darren's small band skirted enemy lines, traveling under assumed banners or at night. They faced travails in the form of roving Lannister patrols, savage storms, and the hungry wolves of the deep forest. But at last, they reached Robb's camp. When they arrived, haggard and battered, they presented the egg to their king. There, in a candlelit pavilion on the banks of the Red Fork, Robb Stark beheld his precious cargo once more. Even in that moment, amid the chaos of war, he felt a stirring in his chest, like hope taking root after a long winter. "Your Grace," Darren said, sinking to one knee and offering the egg, still carefully wrapped. "The old gods kept us safe. The egg is yours." Robb placed a hand on Darren's shoulder and gently lifted him up. "Rise, friend," he said. "You have done a great service to the north. We won't forget it." He took the egg, unwrapped the furs, and saw that same swirling shimmer. It was warmer now, the shell's surface radiating a subtle heat he could feel through his gloves. He could almost sense a faint movement within, a twitch of possibility. He dared not show it too openly in the camp, lest curious eyes pry. So he gathered only a few of his most trusted, among them Great John Umber, Roose Bolton, though there was a darkness to that man Robb did not fully trust, and a handful of stalwarts, and explained in quiet words what they had found. Some reacted with awe, others with skepticism. The Great John bellowed a laugh that echoed in the night, proclaiming that soon the Lannisters would be nothing but ash beneath the wings of a northern dragon. Roose's pale eyes glittered with a strange calculation. Robb ended the meeting swiftly, unwilling to risk more conversation about it. He ordered the men to keep silent or suffer dire consequences. If word spread, the entire realm would scramble to seize that egg. As the nights lengthened, Robb found himself wrestling with doubt. Even if the dragon hatched, how long would it take to grow? How could he feed it, train it, ensure it did not ravage friend as well as foe? And if it never hatched, all this was only a distraction from the pressing war. Yet each time he felt the egg's warmth, he sensed an undercurrent of life. He recalled the dream he'd had. He prayed the real beast would not have those terrible blue eyes. Pressured on multiple fronts, Robb made an agonizing decision. He would try to replicate Daenerys Targaryen's rumored success using fire. The Red Fork camp provided neither the secrecy nor the resources for such a drastic measure, though, so he needed somewhere more secure. Word came that the forces of the north had taken Harrenhal from a small Lannister garrison, thanks to a cunning maneuver by Roose Bolton. Harrenhal was a fortress of haunted reputation, its once grand towers melted by dragon flame long ago. Within its blackened walls lay plenty of space for secrecy, if one dared risk the curses said to hang over it. Robb's bannermen insisted it was a strong strategic point in the Riverlands. With some trepidation, Robb decided that Harrenhal might serve as the place to attempt the hatching. When he arrived at Harrenhal, he felt an unease seeping from the scorched towers and twisted halls. The ghost of Balerion the Black Dread still seemed to linger here, a memory of Targaryen might. Robb walked the courtyard where once the greatest castle in the realm stood proud, now a ruin of melted stone and broken hopes. Was it fitting or foreboding that he should seek to birth a dragon in the ashes of Dragon's Wrath? In a great hall as cavernous as a temple, Robb set up a hidden enclosure. At its center, he constructed a ring of firewood, a pyre of sorts. Drawing inspiration from the stories, true or not, of Daenerys Targaryen, he intended to place the egg in the midst of roaring flames, to see if the heat would coax it into life. Yet he would not walk into the fire. He had not Targaryen blood, nor did he believe in that brand of sacrifice. Instead, he prayed that the presence of the old gods with him, or the spark of the north, would be enough. Twilight fell, painting Harrenhal's ruins in long shadows. Robb stood before the unlit pyre with only a handful of witnesses. Great John Umber, Darren Hornwood, a sullen Roose Bolton, and a few trusted guard captains. Catelyn was far away, negotiating with the wily Lord Walder Frey. Robb felt her absence keenly. He carried the egg in his arms, its warmth soaking into him. Gray wind prowled the edges of the hall, uneasy. With a nod from Robb, the men used torches to ignite the pyre. Flames licked at the dry wood, growing quickly into a scorching pillar of orange and crimson. Sparks flew skyward, swirling in the gloom. The heat pressed against them, driving them back. Robb stood firm. He inhaled the tang of smoke, heart clenching with anticipation. Could this truly awaken the egg? He stepped closer to the flames, sweat beading on his brow. Carefully, he placed the egg in the heart of the pyre, nestling it among glowing embers. He half expected the shell to crack in that instant, or for the egg to burst with some fiery explosion. But at first it just sat there. The flames surged around it, devouring the wood. The men stood in a ring, breath held, eyes fixed on the spectacle. Sparks danced off the egg's scales, and Robb thought he saw them catch the light like gemstones. Moments stretched. The roar of the fire was deafening. Smoke stung his eyes. He felt a pang of dismay. Was he a fool to attempt this? He recalled the tale that Daenerys had used blood magic, had walked into the flames with the bodies of her husband and a witch, forging some dark pact. Robb had no such offering. He only had the ashes of Harrenhal around him and the steel in his soul. Then, a crack of sound split the air, distinct from the woods popping. The watchers jolted. The egg glowed, the scales burning with color, a living mosaic of red, green, and black swirling in a kaleidoscopic pattern. Another crack sounded, echoing in the hall like a thunderclap. From within the flames, Robb saw faint lines spiderweb across the shell. His heart thundered. The men around him murmured in disbelief. By the old gods, it's happening, Robb thought, scarcely able to breathe. He stepped forward, ignoring the scorching heat that forced everyone else back. Sweat streamed down his face, his hair damp at the temples. He approached the pyre's edge, arms raised to shield himself. Through the shimmering curtains of flame, he could see the egg trembling. Another loud crack, and a large piece of shell flaked away, revealing something that glistened beneath, slick and dark. A shrill cry erupted, a sound that no man in that hall had heard before. It was sharp, piercing, and filled with ancient fury. Robb felt it reverberate through every bone. Great John Umber took a step back, hand on his sword. Roose Bolton's face remained impassive, though a faint twitch betrayed his shock. The cry came again, and the egg split further, shedding shards of shell. A young dragon, small, but undeniably a dragon, emerged from the fire. Its body was dark-scaled, limbs spindly and delicate, with wings that glistened like shadowy membranes in the blaze. The creature's eyes burned a fierce gold, reflecting the flames. It let out another shriek and lurched free from the last remnants of its shell. Robb stood transfixed, half convinced he was dreaming. A living dragon, newly hatched, in Harrenhal's cursed hall. The child of the Targaryen's legacy, and now, possibly, a weapon of the north. Its scaled chest rose and fell rapidly, as though the intensity of life overwhelmed it. Then, with a sudden jerk of its small head, the dragon spat a thin jet of flame at the air. The watchers flinched. Robb could smell the pungent sulfur of its breath. Summoning his courage, he stepped into the ring of searing heat. The hem of his cloak caught fire, and he cast it aside, ignoring the pain that clawed at his arms. He approached the hatchling, which hissed, bearing needle-like teeth. For an instant, Robb thought it might immolate him. Yet he pressed forward, hands raised, voice low and steady. "It's all right," he murmured. Smoke stung his throat. He coughed, but forced himself to speak calmly. as though soothing a frightened horse or dire wolf pup. The dragon, trembling, stared at him with molten eyes. Its wings jittered, beating the hot air. It hissed again, and for a heartbeat, Robb saw a flicker of confusion or curiosity in its gaze. Suddenly, gray wind bounded forward from behind, letting out a low growl, though he kept his distance from the flames. The dragon snapped its head toward the direwolf. Robb froze, certain the fledgling would lash out in terror. But something else happened. The two creatures locked eyes. Perhaps it was the primal kinship of beasts. The dragon's snarl subsided to a rasp. Gray wind stood, tail stiff, ears forward, as though acknowledging a new predator in their midst. Then, Robb reached out slowly, ignoring the heat that scorched his tunic. Gently, he placed a hand on the dragon's back, feeling the slick scales beneath his palm. They were hot, near scorching, but a thrill coursed through him at the contact. The dragon quivered but did not strike. A quiet moment of communion passed. Man and beast, surrounded by the roar of fire in a castle famed for dragonborn devastation. Behind them, the watchers stared in stunned disbelief. Great John let out a whoop of sheer astonishment, half laughter, half terror. The soldiers whispered prayers. Roose Bolton's eyes glimmered with some unreadable emotion, perhaps curiosity or a cunning plan forming. Robb, lost in the moment, only felt the wonder of new life thrumming against his skin. He gently coaxed the hatchling from the pyre, half leading, half carrying it. The dragon stumbled, its small talons scraping the stone floor, smoke rising from its body. Once clear of the flames, it collapsed in a trembling heap, exhausted from birth. Robb stripped off his scorched gloves and cloak, ignoring his singed forearms, and wrapped the creature in a thick piece of damp cloth. It clung to him, claws pricking his leather jerkin. His head lolled, eyes fluttering. Men rushed forward with water and cloth to smother the remaining fire. The hall filled with smoke, swirling around them in ghostly plumes. When it cleared enough to see, Robb knelt, dragon in arms, heart pounding. This was it. The old tales come to life. A true dragon of the north. Even a hatchling was precious beyond measure, carrying the possibility of unstoppable power. He laid it gently on the ground. Its wings trembled, as though uncertain how to move. One of the guards approached too closely, and the dragon hissed, a weak spurt of flame flickering from its mouth. Robb waved him back, a protective edge in his voice. The last thing he wanted was panic swords harming this newborn. Slowly, in front of gathered men, the dragon raised its head, let out one more shrill cry, and then seemed to relax into Robb's arms, as though deciding to trust him. Silence fell, broken only by crackling embers and the low groans of Harrenhal's wind-whipped towers. Then Great John Umber let out a cheer. Others joined, voices echoing in the vaulted ceiling, shouting triumph and wonder. The sound reverberated, carrying the raw excitement of men who had witnessed the impossible. Robb, eyes stinging with sweat and smoke, looked down at the hatchling in a haze of disbelief. Against all logic, it had come to life under the banner of the direwolf, in a place once scourged by dragonfire. A swirl of thoughts tore through him. How would he feed it? Train it? Keep it safe? So many perils lay ahead. But for that singular moment, he allowed himself to feel the hope, the exhilaration. They had a dragon. The North had a dragon. And for better or worse, the war would change. Roose Bolton moved closer, his voice level but tinged with something like calculation. Your Grace, this is a wonder beyond words. The Lannisters will tremble when they learn. We must keep it hidden until it's grown enough to matter. Robb nodded. Aye, we tell no one beyond those we trust with our lives. Word of a newly hatched dragon will bring every Sellsword in the realm down upon us. We cannot parade it about like a trophy. It must be our hidden blade. Bolton nodded, his quiet eyes flicking to the hatchling. We shall do as you command, my king. Greatjon's booming voice cut in. Let me be the first to swear my sword to the dragon of the north. He sank to a knee, a grin splitting his bearded face. The others exchanged uneasy glances, but many followed suit. Roose did not kneel, but he bowed his head, expression unreadable. Robb knew that this moment was the stuff of legends. If they won the war, songs would be sung of the day a Stark hatched a dragon in the melted ruins of Harrenhal. If they lost, all might be ashes. But in the hush, Robb found resolution. He was not his father. He could never be Eddard Stark, who had lived by honor alone. Robb had stepped into a realm of magic and danger. He had to fight cunningly, fiercely, and the dragon was now his to protect. Carefully, Robb lifted the trembling creature. Its heartbeat fluttered against his hands, a frantic rhythm. He cradled it close, letting it feel his warmth, while the men parted to let him pass. Gray Wind padded alongside, casting glances at the newcomer, muzzle twitching. Robb whispered soft words to the hatchling, though he did not know if it could understand. It stared at him with bright gold eyes, a spark of intelligence there, raw but present. His tiny claws poked holes in the cloth. In that fleeting instant, Robb felt a bond, something primal and powerful. Guards doused the pyre's remnants, and the company dispersed. Harrenhal's haunted corridors swallowed them. Robb took the hatchling to a small side chamber that had been prepared with coals for warmth. He fed it slivers of meat from a freshly killed goat, which it devoured with startling ferocity, squeaking and hissing between bites. Its presence was mesmerizing and dangerous, yet it seemed so fragile, no bigger than a large cat. Robb thought of the monstrous dragons in stories, towering over castles, wings spanning half a field. That future seemed distant, but if they could keep this creature alive, if it grew. When the hatchling was sated, it settled onto a bed of thick furs, eyes lidded, as if exhausted. Robb watched it, hardly daring to blink. The men who had witnessed the hatching stood quietly in a ring, awe etched on their faces. An oppressive hush filled the chamber, broken only by the crackle of burning coals. Finally, Robb rose to his feet, turning to address the small group. "We have seen a miracle this night," he said, voice low but carrying. "This hatchling is a secret that must remain with us. Not a word to any soul beyond these walls. We will protect it, nurture it, and use it to free the North from our enemies. But never forget, we are Starks, not Targaryens. We will not become tyrants. We will not let fire consume honor. This dragon will not be a tool of cruelty." Great John thumped a fist to his chest. "Aye, my king." The others nodded, a hush of assent. Only Roose Bolton hesitated a fraction, his pale eyes flicking from the hatchling to Robb. He gave a thin smile. "Of course, Your Grace. The North remembers." Robb felt a chill at those words, but steeled himself. If the knowledge of the dragon spread, no one would rest until they had it for themselves. The realm was already in chaos. Stannis Baratheon, Joffrey Lannister, Renly's memory, Daenerys Targaryen across the narrow sea. And now, a new power rose in Harrenhal's melted halls, the Dragon of the North. He silently vowed that he would see this war ended on his terms, that he would avenge his father's death, protect his sisters, and restore the Stark name to glory. That night he slept little. Instead, he tended the dragon, cleaning its small scales where bits of eggshell clung, feeding it more bits of goat. He watched it gingerly test its wings, flapping them with uncertain grace. Sometimes it stumbled, letting out a pitiful squeak. Other times, it gave off a faint glow in the flickering lamplight. Robb found himself smiling at its awkwardness, an unfamiliar sense of delight stirring in his chest. Perhaps there was still wonder in the world, even amid the heartbreak of war. Word of the hatching never reached the rank and file of the camp, but rumors spread that something momentous had occurred in Harrenhal's great hall. Whispers of strange lights, of roars in the night, leaked through the garrison. Robb moved swiftly to stamp out such gossip, threatening dire punishment for any who peddled such tales. The Great John helped by intimidating the men with boisterous threats, and Roose Bolton quietly dealt with a couple of suspected spies in ways Robb preferred not to dwell on. Soon, fear of retribution smothered any further chatter. The next day, ravens brought fresh news of the war. The king in the north steeled himself for new battles, forging alliances, planning raids and mustering his men. He felt an urgency that cut deeper now that a living weapon lay sleeping in a chamber nearby. But the dragon was a hatchling, hardly capable of scorching an army. And so, step by step, Robb continued his campaign, relying on cunning and steel. He resolved to send fresh riders north, to oust Theon Greyjoy from Winterfell and liberate his brothers if they lived. Even as the fighting raged, in stolen moments, Robb snuck away to the hidden chamber where the dragon grew day by day, devouring vast quantities of meat, testing its wings, spitting small flames that scorched the stone walls. He marveled at its strength. Within weeks, it had already doubled in size, though it was still a frail thing by any measure. Its eyes followed him wherever he moved, and sometimes, if he extended an arm, it would crawl up onto his shoulder, nuzzling at his hair with hot breath. Grey Wind watched all with silent fascination, though the direwolf kept his distance. The dragon did not seem frightened of Grey Wind, nor did it threaten him. Perhaps they had found some unspoken truce, an understanding that both were bound to Robb. One day, Robb decided to test the dragon's flight. He coaxed the creature to a cleared corner of Harrenhal's courtyard, away from prying eyes. The ruin provided many hidden nooks. There, under the watchful gaze of only 2 guards, he set the dragon on a low parapet. Its wings unfolded, leathery membranes shining in the afternoon light. Robb gently guided it, encouraging it with calm words, as if urging a child to take its first steps. The hatchling hissed, a note of uncertainty in its cry, but it spread its wings wide. Then, with a leap, it took flight for the first time, an ungainly swoop that sent it flapping and fluttering in disarray before it thumped onto a lower ledge, nearly tumbling onto the stones. Robb rushed forward, worried it might have broken something, but the dragon hissed indignantly and climbed back up. It tried again, more stable this time, rising a few feet before gliding down in a shaky arc. Robb smiled, exhilaration lighting his face. It was learning step by step. He named it Skagos after the rocky island in the north known for its wild nature. The name felt like the right blend of northern legacy and fearsome connotation. Skagos took to the name quickly, or so Robb liked to imagine, for the hatchling would turn its head when he murmured it. Soon, it was gliding around the enclosed courtyard more confidently, though it could not yet sustain a high flight. Soldiers unaware of the secret occasionally passed nearby, but Robb always ensured they saw nothing. A handful of watchers grew used to the sight of Skagos leaping and fluttering, letting out thin streams of flame that licked the stones. Over time, the hatchling's scales grew thicker, the color deepening into a swirling midnight with faint veins of red that shimmered in direct light. But the war pressed on. The Lannisters advanced. Stannis Baratheon marched with his own cause. The North faced Ironborn invasion. Robb's resources strained. He had lost too many men, encountered too many betrayals. As autumn deepened into a chilling herald of winter, he recognized that he could not wait forever for Skagos to become a fully grown dragon. But even a half-grown dragon, if it could fly, if it could breathe enough fire, might terrify a battlefield into submission. With that hope in mind, Robb continued the balancing act, waging a human war of politics and steel, while nurturing a fledgling terror that might shift the tides. When news reached him that the Boltons had reclaimed Winterfell from Theon, it brought momentary joy. Yet that joy soured upon hearing that the castle lay half-ruined, that the young Stark boy's fates remained uncertain, and that Roosa's bastard son, Ramsay Snow, now lurked in Winterfell with ill intentions. The entire North was fracturing under the weight of raids and occupation. Robb yearned to ride north with all his might, but Tywin Lannister threatened the Riverlands, and Walder Frey's loyalty hinged on precarious negotiations. Every path was fraught with peril. In the bleak hours of night, when the wind howled through Harrenhal's battered corridors, Robb would slip away from war councils and arguments, from the tension of half-trusted allies, and sit beside Skagos. He would feed it chunks of venison or mutton, stroke its scales, and watch the flicker of lamplight dance in its keen golden eyes. Sometimes, it seemed to sense his turmoil, crooning a strange note that resonated in his chest. Robb would speak softly, telling the dragon of his burdens, his regrets, his hopes for the North's deliverance. Perhaps Skagos understood nothing, but at least Robb could unburden himself to a living being who would not judge him for compromise or doubt. One particularly cold night, he sat with the dragon in the main hall, near a roaring brazier. He was tired, weighed down by reports of fresh Lannister movements. The hall was mostly deserted except for Grey Wind lurking by the door, and a pair of loyal guards standing watch. Skagos had grown to the size of a large dog now, its wings capable of short flights, its flames scorching enough to blacken stone. It was feeding on a goat's leg, gnawing it fiercely. The crunch of bone echoed as Robb stared into the coals, lost in thought. A voice broke the hush. "Your Grace." He turned to see Roose Bolton standing in the shadows, hands clasped behind his back. The Lord's pale eyes flicked toward Skagos, who looked up from its meal with a hiss. Robb forced a polite tone. "Lord Bolton." Bolton's lips curved in a mild smile. "I came to see how our friend fares." Robb regarded him coolly. "The dragon grows. It will soon be fearsome indeed." Bolton inclined his head. "Indeed, with such a beast, we may force the Lannisters to their knees. Perhaps we could do the same to the Freys, or the Greyjoys, or any who dare defy us." The note in his voice made Robb uneasy. "We will use Skagos to secure the North's freedom. Nothing more." "Of course, Your Grace." Bolton's tone was silky. "We all want the North safe, and if you play your pieces wisely, you could rule not just the North, but perhaps all of Westeros." He studied Robb's face. "With a dragon at your command, the possibilities are endless." Robb frowned. "My father never had such ambition. Nor do I. We want only independence, the right to govern ourselves free of Southern tyranny. That is all." A flicker of something passed through Bolton's eyes. Contempt or cunning. "A wise stance, certainly. Still, we do what we must. Sometimes, a man must break old vows or forge questionable alliances to ensure victory. We cannot let lesser scruples hamper us. Can we?" Robb's jaw tightened. "We will not stoop to savage deeds. The North does remember, Lord Bolton, and we remember what it means to stand for honor." For a moment, Bolton said nothing. Then he offered a small bow. "As you say, Your Grace." He turned to leave. Before disappearing into the dark corridor, he glanced once more at Skagos, who growled low in its throat, protective of its meal. Bolton gave a ghost of a smile and vanished. In his wake, Robb felt an icy tension crawling across his skin. He stroked Skagos' scaled neck, calming the dragon, though he was the one who needed calming. He realized that some men would do anything to harness a dragon's power, to shape the realm however they wished. He had to be careful to protect Skagos not only from enemies without, but from those within who might covet such destructive potential. The war had taught him that men could betray for far less. Yet for all these fears, the presence of the hatchling gave him renewed resolve. He rose from the brazier and left the hall, Skagos following at his heel with a reptilian sway. Grey Wind joined them. Together, they climbed to a high balcony that overlooked Harrenhal's courtyard. The air bit cold against Robb's face, and the sky stretched above them, vast and star-flecked. He gazed at the distant horizon, imagining the North under a free banner, imagining Winterfell rebuilt, safe from all threats. Behind him, Skagos let out a tiny roar, as if challenging the night. Robb smiled. Perhaps their cause was not hopeless after all. He remembered his father's lessons, that winter would always come, but so too would spring. In the battered fortress once burned by dragons, a new flame flickered. If he wielded it well, the king in the North might yet forge a tomorrow where the Stark banner flew proudly, and neither lion nor kraken nor any false king could break their spirit. In the coming days, the war's events would steer Robb Stark down paths he never expected, paths of betrayal and heartbreak and fleeting victory. But that night, with a young dragon at his side, he found in himself a seed of unyielding determination. Fire and ice, Stark and dragon. The old gods stirred, and a new legend was being written in the embers. And at the heart of it stood Robb Stark, king in the North, forging a destiny no man of Westeros could have foreseen. Robb Stark stood upon one of Harrenhal's highest ruined parapets with the chill wind raking through his auburn hair. The night sky stretched vast above him, the moon a dull crescent haloed by drifting clouds. Below, torchlight guttered in the fortress courtyard, where his men shifted on their posts. The hush of late hours descended over broken towers and half-collapsed walls. Even in its ruin, Harrenhal was immense. Once the mightiest castle in Westeros, now haunted by the memory of Dragonfire. The same memory that had warped its stones might yet herald the North's deliverance, if his newly hatched dragon could grow strong enough, soon enough. Skagos was curled at his feet, no bigger than a rangy hound, but possessed of an aura that both awed and unsettled. When the moonlight skimmed across the hatchling scales, the swirling black took on glimmers of deep crimson, as if embers lived beneath that carapace. The creature's wings trembled in the cold, or perhaps from some dream. Even while it slept, its breath whistled in a faint undertone, a half-hiss that never fully relaxed. Robb crouched, pressing one hand to its sleek neck. He felt the heat that radiated from Skagos, far greater than any beast of flesh and blood. It was like touching a forge. He remembered how the hatchling had crawled from the flames of that improvised pyre in the Great Hall, an impossible sight that had changed the course of his war. He glanced up at the sky again. Gray Wind stood behind him, watchful. The direwolf's ears were pricked, keen eyes glancing from the dragon to the horizon. In the distance, the faint cry of a nightbird broke the silence. Robb breathed out slowly, letting the tension ease from his shoulders. These nights at Harrenhal were strange. Legends pressed in on all sides, mixing with his own fear of what must come next. The realm was still at war. Yet in all that turmoil, he found moments like this, almost tranquil, with only starlight and a warm-scaled hatchling for company. He felt a tug in his chest, recalling how quickly everything had gone awry since Ned Stark's death. One moment, he had been a boy with a father's guiding hand. The next, the North was howling for vengeance. Now he was king in the North, battered by betrayals, threatened by Lannisters and Ironborn, with only a fraction of the men he had once commanded. And yet, in this darkest hour, the old gods had placed an impossible boon in his care, a living dragon. He had named it Skagos, after the wild island in the Shivering Sea, as if to honor the savage heartbeat of the North. He prayed he would prove worthy of the beast's trust, that he would not warp the dragon's power for cruelty, nor let it be stolen by men who wished to bend the world to ashes. Quiet footfalls sounded on the nearby stairs. Robb turned, half expecting Roose Bolton's pale visage to emerge from the gloom, but it was instead Great John Umber, looming like a walking mountain, breath steaming in the cold. He dipped his head in greeting, his voice hushed out of deference to the sleeping dragon. "Your Grace," said the Great John. "I thought I'd find you here." Robb inclined his head. "I needed air." The Great John rumbled. His gaze swept the courtyard below, then settled upon Skagos with unconcealed wonder. "He grows quickly, doesn't he?" "He does," Robb said, rubbing the hatchling's neck ridges. Skagos shifted in his sleep, releasing a small, fiery snort. "He's already bigger than he was a fortnight ago." The Great John exhaled, letting out a soft chuckle. "Your mother would scarcely believe her eyes if she saw you here with a dragon at your feet. Half the North wouldn't believe it if they didn't see it themselves." Robb felt a stirring of longing. He wished his mother were here, to share the burden and the wonder. "I'll send for her once it's safe. For now, this must remain a closely held secret." The big man nodded. He was not the subtlest of Robb's allies, but he was fiercely loyal. "We all stand ready for your orders, Your Grace. But I'll say it plainly, men grow restless. This war drags on, and the Lannisters pick at our flanks while Frey's scheme behind us. We need a bold stroke, something that'll show the realm we've still the means to break our foes." Robb understood. The Great John spoke for many lords who'd followed him south. They had marched to avenge Ned Stark and claim northern independence. But the path had become more treacherous than any had foreseen. "And you think the dragon might provide that stroke?" The Great John set his huge hands on his hips. In time, but the men want to see action. Some call for an assault on the Lannister armies in the field. Others say we should ride north and reclaim Winterfell from that bastard Ramsay Snow. Robb's jaw tightened at the mention of Ramsay. He had read the increasingly alarming tidings from the north. Theon's brief rule had ended, but the bastard of Bolton now claimed to hold the castle in Robb's name while, in practice, sowing terror among the small folk. Countless rumors implied that Bolton men were as cruel as the Ironbow. Robb found himself torn. Honor demanded he rescue his brothers if they lived, or at least secure Winterfell from the claws of usurpers. But the war in the south was a conflagration threatening to consume them all. Tywin Lannister was no fool. The moment Robb abandoned the Riverlands, his enemies would pounce. He rose slowly, mind-churning. We'll need a plan that does both, Great John. We can't forsake the Riverlands, not yet. But neither can we leave the north to the likes of Ramsay Snow. Then where do we strike first? Robb gazed out over the half-collapsed walls. Beyond them, the Riverlands extended into the gloom, dotted with farmland and ruined villages, all under the long shadow of Lannister aggression. We'll harry the Lannisters. We won't let them gather strength. If Tywin commits his main force, we'll withdraw into the rough country around the Blue Fork. We must avoid any pitched battle we can't be certain of winning. In time, if the dragon grows to a fearsome size, that's when we deliver a decisive blow. The Great John's grin was wolfish. And after that blow, you'll turn north and bury that Bolton bastard in his own dungeons. Robb took a steadying breath. Yes, we'll free Winterfell and place men I trust in charge until I can return. I'll not leave my people under the tyranny of traitors. The Boltons pay lip service to me now, but I sense the danger. If they think they can usurp me, they'll try. The Great John's voice dropped. Roose Bolton is cunning, but he's not unstoppable. When the time comes, Robb nodded. We'll act. I'll do everything in my power to protect the north. This dragon, if the gods are kind, it might tip the balance. But I won't rely on it alone. The men must see me lead from the front. I can't stay hidden away at Harrenhal forever. The Great John put a hand the size of a plate on Robb's shoulder, the warmth of it palpable even through Robb's cloak. You have my sword, your grace. I've no taste for skulking. Give the word, and we'll ride. Robb paused, looking down at Skagos. The hatchling's eyes cracked open at the sound of conversation, glowing gold in the darkness. It let out a soft hiss and unfolded its wings, as if in languid protest at being woken. Robb bent and murmured a calming word, gently scratching under the creature's chin. He felt the ridges of new scales forming, each day more pronounced. In a matter of months, perhaps Skagos might be large enough to carry a man, if legend held true about how quickly dragons could grow when well-fed. But that was still speculation. No one living in Westeros truly remembered how the Valyrians had raised their dragons. Soon, he thought, soon. He glanced at the Great John, who waited patiently. Gather the captains tomorrow at dawn, Robb said at last. We'll finalize our next strikes. For now, get some sleep. Are you not retiring, your grace? Eventually, Robb turned his gaze to the starlit sky. I'm not done thinking yet. The Great John took his leave, footsteps echoing away. Robb remained with Grey Wind and Skagos, standing vigil at the parapet as the wind carried the memory of old battles through Harrenhal's broken arches. When morning came, Robb convened a war council in one of Harrenhal's lesser halls. A wide oaken table stood at its center, scarred by centuries and blackened near the edges where flames had once licked the stone floors. Dust motes danced in the pale light of high windows. Northern banners draped the walls here, though faint outlines suggested that once Targaryen or Coheri's sigils might have hung. Now, the direwolf was the only heraldry displayed, flanking the remains of the cursed castle's battered architecture. Key lords and officers of the northern host assembled, including Great John Umber, Darren Hornwood, Robin Flint, Meej Mormont's designated captain, and a handful of others. Roose Bolton arrived last, moving with his customary quiet. He had a way of blending into the background even when wearing the flayed man of House Bolton on his breast. Robb felt a subtle prickle of unease as Bolton took his seat, a small smile curling his lips. "All are here," Robb said, voice carrying in the hush. "We have decisions to make." He began by summarizing recent intelligence. The Lannisters, commanded by Lord Tywin, were massing in the southeast near the Blackwater, presumably to counter any aggression from Stannis Baratheon, who still claimed the Iron Throne by right of his brother's true lineage. Meanwhile, King's Landing remained under the boy King Joffrey. The Riverlands were still contested. Riverrun held out under the Blackfish's leadership, but the region suffered. The Freys, as usual, were a problem. And in the north, the Boltons' questionable loyalty stirred rumors of atrocities committed in Winterfell's name. Theon Greyjoy was either captive or on the run. No one knew for certain. "We cannot mount a direct assault on King's Landing," Robb said, pointing to the rough map spread across the table. "Nor can we afford to let Tywin gather his full strength and roll westward unopposed. We must keep him guessing. Strike where he's weak, disappear when he's strong. Hit his supply lines, destroy his foraging parties. He'll have to keep men in check. This is how we hold the Riverlands without sacrificing the main host." "And what of the Freys?" asked Daron Hornwood. "They were quick enough to bend the knee when we first claimed the kingship, but their allegiances shift as readily as the twins' current." Robb's jaw set. "My mother is negotiating with them now, though I suspect Lord Walder demands concessions. We have no choice but to treat with him carefully. He holds a vital crossing. If we refuse him, we risk being pinned down. If we humor him, we risk insult or betrayal." The Great John gave a harsh laugh. "If we had a legion of dragons, we could melt the twins to slag." Robb felt all eyes flick toward him at the word dragons. Though only a few truly knew the scope of the rumor, that one was here in Harrenhal, small and growing. Roose Bolton arched an eyebrow ever so slightly, a near imperceptible motion. Robb spoke carefully. "We have no legion of dragons, only steel, cunning, and the will of the North. That must suffice. For now, the Freys remain our allies in name. We will see what terms my mother can secure. Until then, we keep them close, watchful." "The Karstarks?" asked Meege Mormont's captain. "Lord Rickard is dead. His heir, Harrion, is a captive of the Lannisters." Robb's chest tightened at that memory. The execution of Rickard Karstark's sons had driven Karstark to rage, culminating in tragedies Robb would prefer not to recall. But here, in this alternate path, some events had not fully played out or had shifted. "We still have Karstark men with us. They are angry, vengeful. We must keep them in line, or their thirst for blood will lead them astray. I'll speak with their commanders, ensure discipline." They went on like this for the better part of an hour, discussing logistics, picking targets for raids, orchestrating how best to avoid confrontation until conditions were favorable. At last, the Great John slammed a large palm on the table. "Enough talk, then. We ride. Let me lead a strike into Lannister-held country near Ashmark or the Golden Tooth. A swift raid to let them know the wolf still has fangs." Robb nodded. "We'll coordinate with the Blackfish at Riverrun. Push them from 2 directions. Keep your men mounted and carry minimal baggage so you can move quick." He cast his gaze around the room. "We won't abandon the Riverlands to the lions. But remember, do not engage Tywin's main force in open battle. Retreat if it comes to that." The men signaled agreement, though Robb saw in their faces the frustration of having to fight a war without the glory of a decisive victory. They wanted a single day on the field that would break the Lannisters once and for all. Robb couldn't blame them, yet he also knew that Tywin commanded more men, better supply lines, and was ruthless beyond measure. Fighting him head-on would be madness. A voice quietly rose, Roose Bolton's. "My king." Robb turned. "Speak, my lord." Bolton rested his fingertips on the table's edge. "I have acquired certain talents within my retinue. Men adept at moving unseen, collecting whispers, forging alliances. It may be beneficial to use them in the south, sowing discord in Tywin's chain of command or gleaning intelligence from the Freys. Subterfuge can cripple an enemy just as surely as the sword. The Great John snorted. Sounds like you want to dabble in the black arts. Spies and assassins. Bolton's smile did not reach his eyes. War is a black art, Lord Umber. One we must practice with all available tools. If the king in the north wishes, I can dispatch discreet parties to gather information on the Freys, the Lannisters, anyone who might threaten our cause. Robb felt an instinctive twinge of distrust. Yet he could not deny the importance of intelligence. Agreed, he said slowly, but ensure they understand, we are not to engage in needless butchery or cruelty. I'll have no flayed corpses paraded in the south. We stand by northern honor. Bolton bowed his head. Of course, Your Grace. The council adjourned. Men filed out into the corridors of Harrenhal, some preparing to march within days, others to remain behind. Robb lingered by the table, tracing the lines of the map with a gloved finger. He felt the weight of command pressing on him anew. No single stroke could end this war now, not unless Skagos grew overnight into a beast that could match Balerion the Black Dread. That was a child's fantasy. Reality demanded cunning, patience, and alliances kept afloat by fragile trust. When he straightened, Grey Wind was at the door, tail swishing. The direwolf's presence reminded Robb of simpler days, hunting in the Wolfswood with his father. Now everything was complicated, and each choice carried the potential for catastrophe. Outside, in a side courtyard, the men were already shouting instructions and packing gear. The clang of steel on steel resounded from the blackened training yard, followed by the whinnying of restless horses. Stepping into the torchlit corridor, Robb found himself nearly colliding with Roose Bolton, who had lingered as well. The man blinked in quiet surprise, then offered a thin-lipped smile. My apologies, Your Grace. I didn't mean to startle you. Robb's posture grew wary. No harm done. Bolton's gaze flicked to Grey Wind, then back to Robb. A most impressive beast, your direwolf. And from what I hear, your other companion grows daily. Robb lifted his chin. He does. Perhaps soon, it will be strong enough to take wing? Perhaps, Robb replied, feeling the tension coil in his gut. If the gods favor us. Bolton's face was a mask of polite neutrality. Truly a remarkable turn of fortune for House Stark, to be touched by the power of dragons. I imagine many lords would envy you that. Even Targaryens might quake, to see a new dragon rise under a different banner. Robb held his gaze. Those who think to claim or control my dragon will find themselves disappointed, Lord Bolton. He is not a prize for any but the North, if I can help it. Of course. Bolton lowered his eyes in a show of deference. I only mean to say, we should be mindful of the opportunities it presents, and the dangers. A dragon is as likely to burn those close to it if handled carelessly. Robb's tone cooled. I appreciate your concern. Rest assured, I keep Skagos well in hand. As you should, Bolton murmured, inclining his head. I'll leave you to your preparations. Robb watched him go, the man's footsteps silent on the stone floor. A faint unease gnawed at him. He had accepted the Boltons' help because the northern cause needed every sword. But that house was known for its cruelty. If Roose Bolton realized how precarious Robb's position truly was, might he attempt to turn the dragon to his advantage? The memory of that mocking glint in Bolton's eyes earlier haunted Robb. He forced the thoughts aside. He had a host to lead, a war to wage. The dragon was his to guard, not to flaunt. For now, he must trust that no open betrayal would occur so long as Bolton believed Robb's cause would prevail. If that faith wavered, everything could unravel. In the days that followed, a large portion of the Northern Army departed Harrenhal under the Greyjohn's command, heading west to strike at Lannister positions near the Tumblestone. Robb remained at Harrenhal with a smaller retinue, enough to hold the fortress for now. Bolton moved out as well, leading his own troops under the guise of supporting the Greyjohn's raids. More quietly, Bolton's special men also scattered, riding under different banners, presumably to gather intelligence or sow discord. Robb gave them little thought so long as they left no savage footprints behind. Each morning, Robb checked on Skagos, The dragon had its own enclosed corner of the courtyard, an area walled in by melted towers and half-fallen walls that gave just enough privacy. There, Robb had set up brazier pits, allowing the space to remain warm in the cool autumn air. The hatchling devoured sheep and goats with voracious hunger. Harrenhal's servants scrambled to keep up with the demand, though they never fully saw what was being fed. Robb told them only that he required fresh carcasses daily for training direwolves. If some suspected more, fear of punishment kept them silent. Skagos's appetite was insatiable, but so was his growth. Within weeks, the hatchling could climb low walls with the help of its claws, gliding short distances with abrupt flaps of its leathery wings. It still tired quickly, often collapsing after a vigorous attempt, but each day showed improvement. Robb marveled at the creature's cunning eyes, which followed him whenever he approached. Sometimes, Skagos let out a warbling cry that almost seemed plaintive, and Robb would approach to stroke the dragon's long neck. The scales were warm, no hot, to the touch, but the creature allowed his hand. There was a bond forming, or so Robb imagined, a trust that neither direwolf nor dragon had ever fully shared with humans before. He spent hours alone in that courtyard, teaching Skagos to respond to his voice. He tried various calls and whistles as if training a hound. The dragon, proudly aloof at times, would respond if rewarded with fresh meat. Gray Wind often lounged at the perimeter, watchful and silent, the two beasts regarding one another in a tense neutrality. Robb was grateful they had not yet clashed in violence, though he could sense that each recognized the other as a predator. Perhaps only their shared bond with Robb kept them from open hostility. Amid these private sessions, ravens arrived almost daily with news of battles in the west. The Grachan's raids proved successful, hitting small Lannister outposts and supply convoys, capturing wagons of grain, and freeing peasants conscripted into forced labor. Tywin responded with heavier patrols, but so far, he had not committed his main force. The Blackfish wrote that the Tully banners still held Riverrun secure, though the siege lines tightened. Robb's men had to remain mobile. If Tywin ever pinned them against a river with no crossing, they would be doomed. Meanwhile, his mother's letters came sporadically. She was at the Twins now, negotiating with Walder Frey. The old man demanded everything from marriages to titles, from gold to expanded lands. Lady Catelyn tried to keep him placated with vague promises while insisting the crossing remain open to northern armies. None of it was guaranteed. Robb felt the tension in each word she wrote. One misstep, and the Freys might become active foes, though Walder Frey rarely liked to dirty his own hands. He preferred to let the realm tear itself apart and side with the victor at the last moment. And always, the North loomed in Robb's mind. Winterfell was said to be a smoldering shell. Rumors claimed that Ramsay Snow had declared himself castellan there, plundering what little remained. Another rumor said Bran and Rickon might still be alive, hidden by servants. Yet no one knew the truth. Each day that passed was a knife twisting in Robb's gut. But he could not simply abandon the Riverlands to Tywin. Not yet. If the dragon were grown enough to help, that thought always led him back to Skagos. In quiet hours, he debated if the creature might soon manage short flights beyond the fortress walls. If it could become a terror in the skies, it might turn the tide, even at half-grown. But he recalled tales of the Targaryens. A young dragon was vulnerable, easily slain by a well-aimed arrow or a scorpion bolt. To risk Skagos prematurely might doom them all. Patience, he told himself. We must wait. One late afternoon, as the sun bled red over Harrenhal's melted towers, Robb ventured into the hidden courtyard. Skagos was perched atop a chunk of collapsed masonry, wings partly unfurled to catch the last warmth of daylight. The dragon had grown longer in the body, the neck thicker, the scales more pronounced. It eyed Robb's approach with a flick of its spined tail. Robb carried a large piece of venison, fresh from the kitchens. The dragon hissed appreciatively at the smell. Hungry, are we? Robb murmured. He tossed the venison. With a swift snap of jaws, Skagos snatched it from the air, tearing into raw meat. The sound of gnashing teeth was disturbingly loud. Its throat convulsed as it swallowed large chunks. For a moment, the creature's golden eyes slid shut in bliss. Robb moved closer, checking for any sign of injury or abnormal scale growth. The Targaryen histories hinted that dragons sometimes grew twisted if malnourished, or stunted if confined. But Skagos seemed healthy, strong. When the last morsel was devoured, the dragon gave a small belch of smoke, then hopped down from the masonry, crossing to Robb with a prowling gait. Robb steadied himself, letting Skagos push its snout against his torso. He reached up to scratch beneath the jaw, and the dragon's eyelids drooped in contentment. "You'll fly soon," Robb said softly. "We'll do it in secret out of arrow range. Then maybe you can help me rid Winterfell of its invaders." "How would you like that?" A low rumble emanated from Skagos, neither a growl nor a purr, but something in between. Smoke drifted from its nostrils. Robb felt a surge of mingled excitement and anxiety. There was no precedent for this. He was not a Valyrian dragonlord, nor had he studied the arcane arts of old Valyria. He only had his northern grit and a bond forged in fire. But in the hush of that courtyard, with the sky tinted scarlet overhead, hope shone as bright as any star. He was startled from his reverie by a figure entering through a narrow arch. It was Daron Hornwood, face drawn with urgency. At sight of Skagos, the man stopped short, but quickly bowed his head. "My king, apologies for the interruption." Robb stepped away from the dragon. "No apology needed. What is it?" A tremor shivered in Daron's voice. "A raven arrived just now from the twins. Your mother requests your presence." Robb's pulse leapt. "Tell me everything." Daron held out a scrap of parchment. Robb read his mother's hasty words. Walder Frey was pressing for a marriage alliance to secure the crossing. A marriage for Robb or for Arya or for whomever the old man could bind to House Frey. In the old timeline, Walder had demanded Robb's own hand for one of his granddaughters. That vow, in the official story, had been undone when Robb married Jane Westerling. But in this alternate scenario, there was no mention of Jane yet. The letter indicated that Walder's demands were intensifying. Unless the king in the north came in person to treat with him, the crossing might be closed. Robb crumpled the parchment. "He wants me to grovel at his feet. He knows I need that crossing if I'm to keep fighting in the Riverlands, or to return north when the time comes." Daron nodded grimly. "Aye, my king. Lady Catelyn requests you come, if you can spare the time. Otherwise, she fears Walder might shut his gates entirely." Robb set his jaw. "So be it. I'll go. Prepare a small escort, only those loyal men we can trust. I won't bring the entire host. We can't weaken Harrenhal too much, and I'll not risk Skagos on the road." Daron dipped his head. "As you say, your grace. We'll be ready by dawn." Robb glanced at the dragon, which had resumed gnawing on the leftover bones. A wave of worry coursed through him. Leaving Harrenhal meant leaving Skagos behind. The Great John was away raiding, Bolton was also in the field, and many of his men were scattered. But he couldn't carry a dragon in a cage to the twins. Walder Frey's brood would certainly pry, and the secret would come out. That might put the entire realm on high alert. No, Skagos must stay hidden until it was large enough to defend itself against any attempts at capture. Robb knelt beside the beast, stroking its scale-plated shoulder. "I have to go," he whispered. "Stay safe. Grow strong." Skagos flicked its tongue over razor teeth, as though tasting the tension in the air. Robb exhaled. "We'll be back before long. The men here will care for you, but if anything seems amiss, watch yourself." He knew he was speaking as if the dragon fully understood, but in some part of him, he believed Skagos sensed more than any normal beast. Perhaps it was a fool's hope. Regardless, he had no choice. Walder Frey's demands would not wait, and the future of the war might hinge on this negotiation. Rising, Robb left the courtyard. A swirl of cold air following him as he passed beneath the arch. Skagos watched him go, those gold eyes glinting like coals in the gathering dusk. At dawn, Robb and a small retinue of 200 mounted men rode out from Harrenhal. Hornwood accompanied him, as did a handful of loyal bannermen, Robin Flint, Edric Tallheart, a contingent of Mormont soldiers, and others whose presence would show that the king in the north did not arrive alone. They took provisions for a fortnight's journey. The keep at Harrenhal was left under the command of an older knight, Ser Wylus Manderly, who was stern and decent enough to guard the secret of the dragon. Robb made it clear that none but Ser Wylus and a chosen few were to tend Skagos. To reduce the chance of infiltration, he placed a doubled guard at the courtyard's entrances. Riding away from those melted towers, Robb felt a pang of worry, as if he were leaving behind part of his soul. Grey Wind loped alongside the column, ever watchful. Hornwood rode at Robb's flank, scanning the rolling lands ahead. The first days of travel proved uneventful. The company skirted the worst of the war-torn roads, following lightly trodden paths that wound around half-burned villages. They saw scattered refugees with hollow cheeks, dragging carts of meager belongings. Some recognized Robb's banner, mustering a flicker of hope. He offered them what aid he could, though his own supplies were limited. War had reduced the Riverlands to ash and sorrow, and more than once, Robb thought of how differently things might have gone had Ned Stark lived. That sense of regret, that burning desire for justice, spurred him on. As they approached the twins, the terrain flattened into marshy ground, broken only by the broad river that the Freys ruled from their twin castles. The crossing, two near-identical keeps standing on either side of the Green Fork, loomed in the distance. Stunted trees dotted the banks, their leaves russet and gold in the autumn light. The fortress towers jutted upward like spears aimed at the sky. Each tower bristled with men. Flags bearing the Frey sigil, two blue towers on a silver-gray field, flapped listlessly in the breeze. Trumpets announced their arrival. Frey soldiers scrambled to arrange themselves on the battlements, halberds at the ready. Robb knew Walder Frey relished these little shows of power. He led his men forward, halting just shy of arrow range. A herald in Frey colors rode out to meet them, demanding they state their purpose. Robb stood in the stirrups, letting the herald see the direwolf banners. His voice carried, "Tell Lord Walder I have come at his request, to parley regarding our alliance. I am Robb Stark, king in the north." The herald's eyes flicked over the northern riders, noting their number. "A small escort, your grace." Robb said nothing, but Hornwood's scowl was enough to make the herald bow hastily and retreat. In due time, the great gates creaked open, and the Freys directed Robb's party to cross. The men rode in single file across the wide stone bridge that spanned the Green Fork, the water flowing swift and murky beneath. The air smelled of damp reed beds and old fish. Frey guards eyed them suspiciously from every arrow slit, but Robb maintained a calm dignity, refusing to show intimidation. If Walder Frey wanted to rattle him, he'd be disappointed. Within the courtyard, the Freys had assembled. A crowd of younger heirs and grandsons milled about, black-haired, brown-haired, freckled, tall, short, all bearing a vaguely similar cast. Robb recognized a few from earlier dealings: the sour-faced Ryman, the slight-faced Perwyn, a handful of others. At the front stood old Walder Frey himself, perched on a dais draped with blue cloth. He looked every bit as wizened as Robb remembered, though his eyes glinted with cunning. "King in the north," Walder announced, voice quavering yet somehow grating. "How honored we are that you've come to see us at last." Robb reined in his horse and inclined his head. "Lord Frey, my mother said you wished an audience. Here I am." Walder's mouth curved in a near-toothless grin. "And do you come prepared to make amends for your previous neglect of my house?" he croaked. "Where is your dear mother? Has she decided to hide herself away?" Robb slid from the saddle. "My mother is within. I shall join her. This is a negotiation of terms, is it not?" "Oomph." Walder made a dismissive gesture. "We shall see how much negotiation is needed. Come, let us feast, though you brought so few guests. I expected more courtesy from a king. Or do you think me unworthy of a proper retinue?" Hornwood bristled at the insult, but Robb merely lifted a hand. "I trust you appreciate that I cannot spare a larger force while the Lannisters roam. I come in good faith." Walder harumphed, then stepped down from the dais with the help of a granddaughter who might have been 14 or 40. It was difficult to tell with the brood. "Show him to the hall," he said to his servants, "and see to the horses. We wouldn't want them to starve, even if their master forgets his obligations." Robb and Hornwood exchanged a glance but kept silent. The phrase led them into the twins' main hall, which was decorated in threadbare finery and smelled faintly of musty rushes. Long tables bore cold joints of mutton, trenchers of bread, flagons of ale. Walder Frye took his seat at the dais. Lady Caitlin stood there, flanked by a few of Robb's men who had come with her earlier, her expression carefully neutral. Relief flickered in her eyes when she saw her son. Robb kissed her cheek, noting the tension in her posture. "Thank you for coming," she murmured. "He's been more demanding than ever. I fear we have little time to placate him." Walder beckoned them closer with an impatient wave. Robb and Caitlin approached, leaving most of the northern retinue behind. Several Frye sons and daughters crowded around the edges, watching intently. A hush fell as Walder Frye spoke. "Now then," the old man began, watery eyes peering at Robb. "We parted ways on uncertain terms last time you crossed my bridge. You promised me certain gestures of good faith, and I have yet to see them." Robb kept his face impassive. "I recall the terms. My crossing was in exchange for the betrothal of Arya to your grandson, and for me to consider a match with one of your daughters. In the original timeline, these terms had been famously disregarded when Robb married Jane Westerling. Here, Robb had simply not returned to fulfill them. I have come to see what arrangement might satisfy both our houses. The war has upended every plan." Walder let out a nasal cackle. "Has it now? You think war is an excuse to ignore your sworn word? A vow is a vow." Caitlin intervened, her voice calm but firm. "My lord, House Stark wishes to maintain our alliance. We are prepared to make new pledges that will bind our families. My daughter Arya is not yet found, but—" Walder cut her off with a sharp gesture. Yes, the whelp ran off, or so you say. Meanwhile, I grow older by the day. I have daughters who need husbands, granddaughters, great-granddaughters. I have sons who deserve high matches. And you, the king in the north, have offered us nothing but empty promises." Robb clenched his teeth. He had no desire to shackle himself or his siblings to the phrase, but necessity drove him to compromise. If Walder barred the crossing, it would cripple his mobility. "Name your terms," he said. Walder's mouth twisted into a leer. "Terms? Let me see. I want 2 of my grandsons fostered at Winterfell when you reclaim it. I want a marriage for one of my daughters to a great lord of the north, someone close to you, not some minor squire. I want gold, enough to restore the twins from the ravages of this war. And I want an apology for your tardiness, spoken publicly at my table." Caitlin stiffened. Robb felt his anger spark. "You ask for a great deal, Lord Frye." Walder sniffed. "Then cross elsewhere if you will not pay. Perhaps you can swim the Green Fork? Or maybe your dire wolf can carry you." At that, a few of the Frye brood tittered. Robb shot them a frosty look. Silence returned. Caitlin reached out and touched Robb's wrist, as if urging composure. Robb took a deep breath, thinking of the men who depended on crossing. He forced his voice to remain steady. "I will foster 2 of your grandsons, provided they meet the proper qualities of an honored guest. I will consider a marriage match, though I will not bind my own future as king. Perhaps one of my bannermen can be found a suitable bride among your daughters." Walder's eyes narrowed. "What of Edmure Tully? He's still unwed, I hear. The Tully blood is nearly as sweet as a Stark's. Let him marry one of mine, in your presence, to seal the alliance." Robb glanced at his mother. She gave a tiny nod, though her face was grim. "We can discuss Edmure," Robb said slowly. "He's at Riverrun. If he agrees, I'm sure we can arrange a match. But I'll not promise a wedding without his consent." "Humph!" Walder glowered, but some cunning calculation sparked behind his rheumy eyes. "Very well. We'll present a bride, and you'll send word to him. Meanwhile, the crossing remains open, so long as you remain in my good graces. But I want that apology. Here. Now." Robb bristled. Lord Fry. Now, Walder snapped. Or our talk is done. The hall fell silent. The gathered Freys stared with undisguised curiosity. Northern men at the edges scowled, hands drifting near their sword hilts. Robb's pride warred with necessity. Caitlyn's soft voice brushed his ear. "Do it," she said. "We have no choice." Robb exhaled through his nose, forcing down his temper. He stepped forward, hands at his sides, meeting Walder Frey's gaze. "I, Robb Stark, King in the North, do apologize for any perceived slight in the timing or fullness of my prior pledge. War has complicated all our lives, but I offer you respect and the desire for a lasting alliance." Walder's grin turned sly. "Perceived slight, is it? That will do. Very well." He leaned back in his seat, letting out a satisfied wheeze. "We'll feast tonight to celebrate this new arrangement. On the morrow, we'll talk more of the betrothal for Edmure Tully. Until then, relax, enjoy our hospitality." The words left a bitter taste in Robb's mouth, but he forced a polite nod. "Thank you for your welcome. If you'll excuse me, I'd see my mother settled and speak with her privately." Walder waved dismissively. The old man's eyes were already darting to a passing servant who carried a tray of sweet wine. Yes, go. We'll talk tomorrow." Robb turned, guiding Caitlyn away from the dais. Hornwood followed, his face thunderous with outrage. Fry guards parted, letting them pass into the corridor beyond the hall. Once out of earshot, Hornwood spat an oath. "That man has no courtesy. To demand such humiliation?" Caitlyn shook her head. "Walder Fry has always taken pleasure in lording power over those who need him. We must endure it." Robb's voice was tight. "I can't abide men like him, yet he controls the crossing. For now, we'll endure." His eyes flicked to Caitlyn. "Let's find a private chamber. We have much to discuss." They were shown to a modest suite of rooms. The corridors of the twins were dimly lit by torches, the walls thick and damp. Servants scurried to light the hearth. When Robb and Caitlyn were finally alone, with Hornwood standing guard outside, Robb let out a ragged breath. "How long have you been here?" he asked. "Less than a fortnight," Caitlyn said wearily, sinking onto a bench. "Your Uncle Brynden is desperate at Riverrun, but we can't pass through freely until Walder's satisfied. I sent for you because I sensed he was ready to close the crossing entirely if you didn't appear." Robb paced. "Well, I'm here now. We've given him his apology, and we'll promise Edmure's hand in marriage if Edmure consents. That might buy time." Caitlyn looked up, eyes heavy with concern. "But time for what, Robb? The war grinds on. The Lannisters have not grown weaker. And what of the North?" The mention of the North struck him like a hammer. "I haven't forgotten Winterfell, but if I can't cross here freely, I can't even bring an army home. Not to mention, Tywin might ravage the Riverlands once we leave." She touched his arm gently. "I know you bear these burdens. I only ask that you remember your brothers. If they yet live." "They live?" Robb said fiercely, clinging to the hope that Bran and Rickon had escaped Theon's madness, that they roamed the wilds or were hidden by loyal folk. "I'll reclaim Winterfell, once the Lannisters are fended off, or if I can muster enough men to break away without losing the South entirely. I need an advantage." Caitlyn's brow furrowed. "An advantage?" Robb cast a glance at the closed door, ensuring they were alone. Then he lowered his voice. "At Harrenhal, I have something you helped bring into my care. The dragon egg. It hatched." Her eyes widened, and her hand flew to her mouth. "Gods, so it's true." He nodded grimly. "I've kept it a secret. The creature Skagos, I named him, he grows daily. But he's not yet large enough to tilt the war. Perhaps in time, we'll have a living flame to wield." Caitlyn's eyes flickered with both wonder and dread. "And no one beyond Harrenhal knows?" "Only a select few of my most loyal men. I worry, though. Roose Bolton suspects. He's cunning. If he or others sense a chance to seize the dragon, I fear treachery." She closed her eyes for a moment, absorbing the enormity of it. A Stark with a dragon. This realm has never known such a thing. We must use it carefully, Robb whispered. I won't become a tyrant, but if Skagos grows enough to intimidate our enemies, maybe we can force a peace, secure the north, free my sisters, rescue my brothers. End this war on our terms. Caitlin nodded, though a sliver of fear lingered in her expression. Dragons can be unpredictable. Even Targaryens lost control at times. Robb squeezed her hand. I know, but I have no other choice. We've tried honor, we've tried alliances, we've tried cunning. Everything in this war is overshadowed by Lannister gold and cunning. The Frey scheme, the Ironborn raid, the Bolton's loom. If the gods gave me a dragon, I'll not waste that gift. She swallowed, then embraced him tightly, motherly concern mingling with resignation. I trust you, Robb. I pray the old gods guide your steps. That night, they feasted in the main hall, enduring Walder Frey's jibes and the watery stew that passed for a celebratory meal. Robb forced himself to drink little and speak less, letting the old man prattle on about genealogies. He spotted numerous young Frey women eyeing him from across the hall, whispering behind their hands. Old Walder insisted on introducing half a dozen, extolling each daughter's or granddaughter's virtues, but the conversation always circled back to Edmure Tully. Robb's mind wandered to Harrenhal and Skagos, to the swirl of responsibilities. He feigned polite interest in Frey courtesy while inwardly longing for the quiet of his bedchamber. At last, the evening ended. Robb retired, posted watchful northern guards at his door, and tried to sleep. His dreams were restless. In them, he saw Skagos perched upon the charred walls of Harrenhal, letting loose a torrent of flame. Then the dragon's eyes turned icy blue, shifting into the visage of a monstrous beast from beyond the wall. Wraith-like shapes swirled in the darkness, and he heard the distant howling of direwolves. When he awoke before dawn, sweat matted his hair, and his heart pounded. War, dragons, White Walkers, the nightmares blurred together, and he could not quite recall the details. But a sense of looming doom clung to him. Dressing quietly, he left the bedchamber and roamed the corridors, ignoring Frey servants who scurried to avoid him. Before long, he stood in a narrow window embrasure, gazing east as the first streaks of dawn colored the sky. The calm hush of early morning wrapped him. The Green Fork's water reflected pale light below. Gray wind padded up behind him and rested a muzzle against Robb's leg, as though sensing his unease. We'll get through this, Robb murmured, stroking the direwolf's head. We'll get the Freys on our side, or at least keep them at bay. Then we'll see to Tywin. When the time is right, we'll return north with a dragon at our side. He did not know if he said it to reassure himself or to calm Grey Wind, but the promise rang in his ears. With a final look at the dawning sky, he set his jaw and turned away to prepare for another day of dancing with Walder Frey's demands. They spent 4 days at the Twins, enough time for Walder to finalize his extortionate list of demands and for Robb to craft measured responses. Caitlin penned letters to Edmure Tully at Riverrun, urging him to consider a Frey bride for the sake of the realm's security. Walder seemed mollified, if not overjoyed, and allowed their small retinue to depart, though he reminded Robb that once a date was set for the wedding, he expected a grand affair. Robb left with relief, his men sharing the sentiment. The crossing was still open, at least for now. He planned to rejoin the Grachan's forces or return to Harrenhal, depending on the letters from the Blackfish. By the time they reached the outskirts of the Frey lands, a raven caught up with them. It bore the sigil of House Umber, the Grachan's urgent request for reinforcements. The Lannisters have moved in force, the letter read. We're outnumbered near Oxcross. Tywin is here. We can't hold them long without you. Robb felt his heartbeat slam. So Tywin had finally committed. The letter mentioned pitched battles, casualties mounting, and the threat of a massive Lannister push that could envelop the northern host. Hornwood looked grave as Robb read the news aloud. What do we do, Your Grace? Hornwood asked. We have only 200 men with us. Even if we rejoin Harrenhal's garrison, that won't be enough to face Tywin in open battle. Robb clenched his fists. We can't leave the Greatjon to be crushed. We'll muster every man we can. Harrenhal should still hold about 1,000, and we can glean more from the scattered bands. If we move swiftly, we might catch Tywin's flank, force him to retreat. Catelyn's face was etched with worry. That is a tall order, Robb. Tywin's main host is large. Will it not be suicide? Robb inhaled sharply, thinking of the old Tully saying, "Family, duty, honor." He had pledged to protect his men, not abandon them. We've no choice. If we let Tywin destroy the Grecians' forces, we'll lose half our strength. Then the Lannisters will sweep through the Riverlands and trap us all. He glanced westward, as though he might see Oxcross on the horizon. We ride for Harrenhal immediately. Pray the men there are ready. Then we'll march to meet the Greatjon, and I'll pray that Tywin has not already sealed their fate. With that, they spurred their horses, galloping away from the twins. The crossing behind them was left in uncertain alliance, yet there was no time to dither. War's demands pulled them inexorably onward. Robb vowed that once he reached Harrenhal, he would see how large Skagos had grown, if the dragon might be ready, even partially, for the field. A raw hatchling might not decide the battle, but if the presence of dragonfire could so panic, that might give Robb the edge to save his men. Swift as the wind, they traveled the same roads back, only with urgency doubling their pace. Hornwood's scouts rode ahead, scouring for sign of bandits or Lannister outriders. At night, they lit minimal fires, pitched tents in defile or glens shielded from view, and doled out meager rations so they could move unencumbered. Each morning, they rose earlier than the sun, pressing onward through farmland littered with the scars of war. Robb's cloak snapped in the wind, and gray wind padded tirelessly at his side, silent testament to northern resilience. At last, after days of hard riding, they spied Harrenhal's looming silhouette. Smoke curled from its gargantuan towers, though the structure looked as dark and forbidding as ever against the sky. The gates stood open, manned by weary men wearing stark colors. Inside the courtyard, a small number of knights and foot soldiers moved about, some caring for horses, others training. Ser Wylus Manderly strode forward, relief evident in his posture. He saluted Robb with a half-bow. "Your Grace, you're safely returned." Robb dismounted. "Aye, but not for long. We have urgent need to gather every man here and march west. Tywin Lannister strikes at Oxcross." Ser Wylus's face clouded. "We can muster quickly enough. There's near 1,000 within the castle. But, Your Grace, I fear. There is news." Robb's heart leapt to his throat. "What news?" Before Ser Wylus could answer, a muffled roar rang out. It seemed to come from one of the adjoining courtyards, echoing off the melted stone. Robb froze, pulse thudding. That was no human noise. It was the cry of something far more primal, something draconic. "Skagos," he breathed, eyes snapping to Ser Wylus. The older knight looked drawn, sweat beading on his brow. "Your Grace, the dragon has grown, but it's become restless. I've done my best to keep it fed and hidden, but without your presence." Another roar cut through the air, sharper this time, carrying a note of anger or alarm. Robb shoved past Ser Wylus, sprinting across the courtyard toward the inner gate that led to Skagos' enclosure. Hornwood and the others hurried in his wake, weapons clattering. As he passed a small guard detail, he shouted for them to remain calm, that all was well. Then he plunged into the narrower corridor that opened onto the courtyard set aside for the dragon. He burst into the enclosure. The sight that greeted him stole his breath. Rubble from a half-collapsed tower had shifted, revealing a gap that led outside, and Skagos stood near it, wings half-furled, hissing furiously at a handful of startled men who brandished spears. The dragon was noticeably larger than when Robb had left, perhaps as long as a small horse now, with a wingspan that fanned out menacingly. Smoke curled from its nostrils, and the ridges of its spine bristled with bright red spines. One of the men had blood on his face, and the smell of singed cloth pervaded the air. "Hold!" Robb shouted, rushing forward. Gray wind barreled in, snapping at any man who didn't obey quickly enough. Skagos swung its head, eyes locking on Robb. The dragon gave a keening shriek, flames flickering in its open jaws. But the moment it recognized him, it hesitated, cocking its head as if uncertain. Robb stepped closer, hands raised. "Easy, boy," he said, voice hoarse with worry. "I'm back. Calm now." The men with spears fell back, relief flooding their expressions. A stablehand stammered, "Your Grace, the tower collapsed last night, exposed part of the wall. The dragon tried to get out. We tried to corral it, but it burned Aemon's arm." Skagos hissed at the mention, jaws parted. Robb eased forward, speaking softly. He recalled all the times he'd approached the hatchling with a hunk of meat in hand. Now the beast was nearly chest-high at the withers, and its head towered above Robb's. But the look in its gold-flecked eyes was oddly familiar. Conflict, fear, longing. Robb inched nearer until he was almost within reach of those fangs. The heat radiating off Skagos was intense. "That's it," Robb whispered. "I'm here. No one will harm you." Behind him, Hornwood and others looked on in stunned silence. Slowly, the dragon lowered its head, a rasping whine in its throat. Robb lifted a hand, pressing it gently to the side of the scaly muzzle. He felt the vibrations of Skagos's breath. A wave of relief and awe surged through him. He could see the progress. These were no longer the delicate hatchling's features. The snout was longer, the teeth sharper, the wings broader. In a few more months, the dragon might be large enough to bear a rider, if it continued this rate of growth. He turned to the men behind him. "No one is to provoke it further. Keep your distance unless you're feeding it. Understand?" They nodded vigorously. The burned man clutched his arm, wincing. Robb beckoned a maester's assistant to tend him. Gray wind circled, sniffing the air. Skagos gave the direwolf a brief glare but did not attack. Robb stroked the dragon's neck, feeling the scaled ridges like warm plate. Yes, there was so much potential here. A creature of living flame that might sow terror among the ranks of Tywin's men. If only Skagos was ready. He stepped back, addressing the cluster of soldiers and servants. "We'll rig a stronger barricade. If we must, we'll open a larger courtyard so Skagos has more space. But do not let it out of Harrenhal's bounds. We can't risk word getting out that we have a dragon. The realm would descend on us." Ser Wylis approached, panting slightly. "Your Grace, about the war. Do we march soon?" Robb nodded, though his gaze lingered on Skagos. "Yes, we ride west to aid the Greatjon. I want you to remain behind with half the garrison. Fortify Harrenhal, keep Skagos fed and safe. I'll leave a handful of men I trust to help you. No one else should be allowed near the dragon without your approval." Ser Wylis bowed. "Understood, Your Grace. But be warned, he's growing restless. If he tears down walls to escape, we might not be able to contain him." Robb clenched his jaw, considering. "Do your best. If needed, open the main courtyard and let him roam there. He must have space, but keep him from flying off. We're not ready for that revelation yet." Skagos gave a snort, almost as if it objected to being caged. Robb felt a pang of sympathy. How could he keep a dragon locked in a ruin? But necessity dictated. Until he was ready to wield Skagos in battle, or to ensure the creature's safety in flight, he had to keep the secret. There was no telling what unscrupulous lords might do if they learned a dragon roamed Harrenhal. Carefully, Robb coaxed Skagos back from the shattered masonry, stepping over stones and twisted beams. The dragon moved warily, huffing, but seemed to calm at Robb's presence. Gray wind followed, tail swishing in agitation. Once the gap was partially sealed by men hauling large timbers, Robb let out a long breath. The crisis was contained, for now. But as he left the enclosure, he couldn't shake a new worry. Skagos was no mere pet. He was a living force of nature, growing in power every day, yearning for freedom in the skies. Robb could not simply keep him locked away forever. The moment was nearing when the dragon would be too large to hide. Tywin's armies pressed the west, the Boltons lurked in the north, and Walder Frey hovered in the middle. Might the time be near for Skagos to join the war, even if half-grown? Robb wrestled with that question well into the night, poring over maps by candlelight in Harrenhal's drafty great hall. Messenger ravens came and went. Each brought more grim tidings from Oxcross. The Great John was in danger of encirclement. Robb needed to ride to his aid within days, or the largest chunk of the Northern Army would be crushed. Yet if he could surprise Tywin, even a glimpse of Dragonfire might shatter the enemy's morale. The risk was monstrous. If Skagos was shot down or wounded, Robb would lose the North's best chance. But if he withheld the dragon too long, what would become of the men dying under Lannister blades? As the candles burned low, he conferred with Hornwood and the other captains. Opinions varied. Some said they should keep the dragon hidden until it was unstoppable. Others argued that a partial advantage was better than none. Hornwood simply said, "A half-grown dragon might be enough to sow terror. The Lannisters have never faced such a beast. At the very least, it'll disrupt their lines." In the end, Robb made his decision. "We march in 2 days. I'll take half the garrison from Harrenhal, plus the men who came from the twins. Ser Wylis stays here with the rest. As for the dragon, I will attempt to bring him with us, but discreetly, at least partway, so we can deploy him at the right moment." The men looked astonished, yet none openly objected. Robb felt the tension of that choice heavy in his chest. He'd need a means to transport Skagos. The creature could walk or be coaxed to glide short distances, but not all day, not across the miles to Oxcross. They might build a makeshift wagon or let the dragon follow in short flights by night. The difficulties were immense. But the alternative, leaving Skagos caged and useless while the Great John died, seemed untenable. That night, Robb stood once more in the courtyard with Skagos, feeding the dragon strips of beef. The creature devoured them eagerly, smoke curling from its mouth. Robb's heart pounded with fear and excitement. Could he truly lead a half-grown dragon into battle? Was he venturing beyond all reason? Or was this the only way to save his men? He remembered how Daenerys Targaryen had walked into her husband's funeral pyre, emerging with dragons. That story had come from beyond the narrow sea, whispered by travelers. The Targaryen queen had used her hatchlings to begin her conquest of slave cities. Perhaps a single dragon, even half-grown, could send the Lannisters fleeing. Skagos huffed, finishing the last scrap of beef. Then it turned those piercing eyes on Robb, as if sensing his turmoil. The dragon's breath washed over him, hot as a forge. Robb gently laid a hand on the scaled flank. "We ride west," he said softly. "And you'll come with me, Skagos, if the gods grant it. We have a war to end." The dragon let out a low rumble, tail lashing. It seemed neither pleased nor frightened, merely ready. Robb felt a flicker of shared purpose. Perhaps man and dragon were forging a bond deeper than words, shaped by the crucible of conflict. Tomorrow or the next day, they would set forth, forging a new legend in the ashes of Harrenhal. And if the realm trembled at the sound of wing beats on the horizon, so be it. He would not let the North burn. If need be, he would burn those who threatened it. And thus, in the hush of Harrenhal's courtyard, the next phase of Robb Stark's improbable campaign began. A king armed with steel and cunning, heart bolstered by the primal roar of a dragon at his side.